Let me begin by inviting you to loosen one belief that has quietly shaped your inner world for a very long time. Many men grow up believing that something outside of them is responsible for their inner turmoil, that there is an opposing force, a presence, an enemy that interferes with their peace, their discipline, their direction. This belief feels comforting in a strange way because it gives pain a source and struggle a villain. But wisdom asks us to look again, not with fear, but with honesty. What you have been fighting was never a being. It was a way of seeing. A perspective is powerful. It determines what you notice, what you ignore, what you fear, and what you chase. Two men can stand in the same situation and live entirely different realities, not because the world changed, but because the lens through which they looked at it did. One sees threat, the other sees challenge. One sees rejection, the other sees redirection. The situation is the same. The experience is not. When a man believes that his suffering comes from an external force, he stops examining his own perception. He looks outward instead of inward, and in doing so, he unknowingly hands over authority to his own misinterpretations. A distorted perspective does not announce itself as distortion. It feels like truth. That is what makes it dangerous. Fear does not say, "I am fear." It says, "This is reality." Doubt does not say, "I am doubt." It says, "This is logic." And once a man mistakes perspective for truth, he begins reacting to illusions as if they were facts. This is how inner conflict is born. A wise man learns to pause and ask a different question. Not what is attacking me, but how am I seeing this? That single shift changes everything. Because the moment you question the lens, you regain agency. You move from victim to observer, and observation is the beginning of freedom. Many of the thoughts that disturb a man are not evil, malicious, or intentional. They are simply unchecked interpretations, old experiences coloring new moments, past wounds projecting future outcomes, cultural narratives whispering limitations that were never personally tested. None of this requires an external enemy. It only requires an unquestioned perspective. Consider how often a man assumes the worst before it happens, how often he interprets silence as rejection, delay as failure, discomfort as danger. These interpretations feel automatic, but they are learned, and anything learned can be examined. When a man believes his thoughts are absolute, he becomes trapped inside them. When he realizes they are perspectives, he gains distance, and distance brings clarity. Clarity does not eliminate hardship. It eliminates unnecessary suffering. A distorted perspective exaggerates threats and minimizes strength. It convinces a man that he is weaker than he is, and that the world is harsher than it truly is. Over time, this perspective becomes a habit, and habits, when repeated long enough, feel like identity. This is why some men say, "I've always been this way," when what they mean is, "I've always seen things this way." A wise man knows the difference. He understands that perspective is not reality, but a filter placed on reality, and filters can be changed. This realization is deeply unsettling at first because it removes excuses. If the struggle is not coming from outside, then responsibility returns home. But with responsibility comes power. A man cannot change what he blames on something else, but he can change how he sees. Perspective shapes emotion before reason ever arrives. You feel before you think, and what you feel is determined by how you interpret what is happening. Change the interpretation and the emotional response follows. This is not positive thinking, it is accurate seeing. A wise man does not tell himself comforting lies. He tells himself clearer truths. He learns to ask whether a thought is useful, grounded, and proportional. He notices when his mind jumps to extremes. He catches himself when he assumes intention without evidence, and instead of reacting, he adjusts his view. Over time, something remarkable happens. The inner world becomes quieter, not because nothing goes wrong, but because fewer things are misread as threats. Life feels lighter, not because it is easy, but because it is no longer constantly resisted. When perspective shifts, inner enemies dissolve. not because they were defeated, but because they were never real in the first place. This is where wisdom matures. A man stops asking how to fight what is inside him and starts asking how to understand it. He stops waging war against his own mind and begins educating it. He recognizes patterns without condemning himself for having them. He learns where his perceptions came from and gently updates them. This process requires humility, the humility to admit, I may not be seeing this clearly, but that humility is strength in its highest form. A rigid perspective demands certainty. A wise perspective allows correction. As clarity grows, fear loses its authority. Doubt loses its grip. Inner conflict softens, not because life becomes predictable, but because perception becomes flexible. A flexible mind does not break under pressure. It adapts, and adaptation is survival at its most intelligent. The greatest liberation a man experiences is realizing that he is not at war with an external force, but in conversation with his own perception. And conversations can change. When a man understands this, he stops searching for enemies and starts refining vision. And in that refinement, he discovers that peace was never stolen from him. It was simply obscured by the way he was looking. Let me continue by guiding you toward a quieter but far more influential truth. Fear does not grow from facts as much as men believe. Facts are often neutral. Fear is shaped by meaning, and meaning is assigned by perspective. This is why two men can face the same circumstance and experience completely different levels of fear. One feels threatened, the other feels alert. One freezes, the other prepares. The facts did not change. The interpretation did. A wise man understands that fear is rarely a response to what is happening. It is a response to what the mind believes might happen. Fear lives in anticipation, not in reality. And anticipation is a mental act, not an external event. Perspective is the architect of fear. When a man assumes the worst, fear expands. When he assumes uncertainty, fear softens. When he assumes possibility, fear transforms into focus. The same information produces different emotional outcomes depending on the lens applied to it. This is why fear often feels irrational, because it is not built on evidence alone. It is built on stories. Stories about loss, humiliation, rejection, failure, or danger. These stories borrow pieces of fact and then exaggerate them through imagination. And the mind, when left unquestioned, treats these stories as warnings rather than assumptions. A wise man learns to ask himself, what am I adding to this situation that is not actually here? That question weakens fear immediately, not by force, but by clarity. Facts are limited. Perspective is expansive. Fear grows in that expansion. Many men believe that courage means ignoring fear, but wisdom teaches something more precise. Courage means separating fact from interpretation. It means recognizing what is known and what is assumed, and assumptions are where fear hides. Consider how often fear arrives fully formed, without explanation. A tight chest, a racing mind, a sense of urgency. When examined closely, these sensations often trace back to imagined outcomes rather than present danger. The body reacts not to reality, but to interpretation. Perspective speaks to the nervous system faster than logic ever could. This is why changing perspective calms the body. When a man reframes a situation accurately, his breathing changes, his posture shifts, his mind slows. Nothing external moved, only the internal lens adjusted. A wise man respects fear without surrendering to it. He listens to what it is signaling, but he does not assume it is correct. Fear can indicate importance without indicating danger, and confusing those two creates unnecessary suffering. Perspective decides whether fear becomes a guide or a prison. A man trapped in fearful perspective believes that discomfort equals threat. He avoids challenges, conversations, risks, and growth. Over time, his world shrinks, not because it is unsafe, but because his lens has labeled it so. Another man with a clearer perspective understands that discomfort often precedes expansion. He feels fear and still moves forward, not recklessly, but consciously. His world grows, not because he is fearless, but because his perspective is accurate. Accuracy is the antidote to fear. A wise man also recognizes how past experiences distort present perception. Old failures whisper into new opportunities. Previous pain colors neutral interactions. Perspective lags behind reality, and it is not updated. And outdated perspectives produce misplaced fear. This is why awareness of history matters, not to relive it, but to contextualize it. A man who understands where his fears were learned can decide whether they still apply. Many fears were useful once. That does not mean they are useful now. Perspective that is never questioned becomes outdated armor, heavy, restrictive, and unnecessary. Fear thrives when perspective is narrow. It fades when perspective widens. When a man considers multiple interpretations instead of clinging to one, fear loses certainty, and fear needs certainty to dominate. This is not about convincing yourself that everything will be fine. It is about acknowledging that you do not fully know how things will unfold. That humility dissolves fear's grip. A wise man replaces catastrophic thinking with probabilistic thinking. He understands that worst-case scenarios are possibilities, not prophecies, and possibilities do not deserve emotional obedience. Perspective also determines how a man interprets himself. Fear intensifies when a man doubts his own capacity. When he sees himself as fragile, fear multiplies. When he sees himself as adaptable, fear transforms into alertness. Self-trust is perspective turned inward. A man who trusts his ability to respond no longer fears every outcome. He knows that even if things go wrong, he will adjust. That confidence does not remove risk, it removes paralysis. Fear loses power when a man believes he can handle what comes. This belief is not arrogance, it is grounded self-knowledge. A wise man knows his limits and his resilience, and that knowledge stabilizes his perception. As perspective matures, fear stops being an enemy and becomes information. It signals importance, not catastrophe. It invites preparation, not retreat. And when fear is used this way, it sharpens rather than weakens. The greatest shift occurs when a man realizes that fear is shaped more by his inner narrative than by external reality. That realization returns authority to where it belongs. Fear no longer controls the man. The man understands fear. And when perspective is clear, fear becomes a companion that walks behind him, not a force that blocks his path. Let me speak to you now about confusion, because confusion is far more dangerous than fear. Fear at least admits it is afraid. Confusion disguises itself as logic. And when a man is confused, he begins to invent enemies without realizing he is the one creating them. A confused mind cannot tolerate uncertainty. It rushes to conclusions, labels, and judgments, because not knowing feels threatening. And in that rush, it misinterprets neutral events as hostile, ordinary challenges as personal attacks, and internal discomfort as external opposition. This is how imaginary enemies are born. Most of the battles a man believes he is fighting are not happening in the world. They are happening in his interpretation of the world. Confusion blurs boundaries. It mixes thoughts with facts, emotions with evidence, memories with the present moment. When everything blends together, clarity disappears. And in the absence of clarity, the mind looks for something to blame. A wise man understands this pattern well. He has seen how easily the mind turns uncertainty into suspicion, how silence becomes rejection, how disagreement becomes disrespect, how delay becomes sabotage. None of these interpretations are facts. They are conclusions drawn by a mind that does not yet see clearly. The confused mind does not ask questions. It assumes answers, and assumptions are the raw material of false enemies. When a man feels unsettled inside, he often looks outside for a cause. He believes something or someone must be responsible for the discomfort he feels. But discomfort does not always come from conflict. Often, it comes from growth, from change, from standing at the edge of the unfamiliar. A confused mind misreads that signal and turns inward tension into outward hostility. This is why some men feel surrounded by opposition even when no one is opposing them. Their mind is at war with uncertainty, and it projects that war onto the world. A wise man pauses when he feels attacked. He asks himself whether the threat is real or interpreted. He examines the evidence. He slows the story down, and very often he discovers that the enemy he was preparing to fight never existed. Confusion also distorts intention. A confused mind assumes T knows why others act the way they do. It fills gaps with speculation, and speculation almost always leans negative when clarity is absent. This creates unnecessary resentment, defensiveness, and isolation. How many relationships have been damaged not by real harm but by imagined motives? A clear mind leaves space for uncertainty. A confused mind fills that space with suspicion. This is why clarity is an act of humility. It requires admitting, I may not fully understand what is happening, and that admission prevents countless internal conflicts. When a man allows for the possibility that his perception may be incomplete, he stops creating enemies prematurely. Confusion also turns the mind against itself. Inner dialogue becomes harsh. Self-judgment intensifies. A man begins to see parts of himself as obstacles rather than signals. Emotions become enemies. Thoughts become threats. He fights himself constantly, believing that control comes from suppression. But a wise man knows that self-conflict is not strength, it is misunderstanding. When a man understands his emotions, they no longer feel like enemies. When he understands his thoughts, they lose their intimidation. Understanding replaces hostility. Confusion thrives on speed. It reacts quickly and speaks loudly. Clarity moves slowly and observes quietly. This is why slowing down is one of the most powerful tools a man has. When he slows his response, he gives clarity time to emerge. Most imagined enemies dissolve. Under examination, a wise man learns to sit with discomfort long enough to understand it. He does not immediately assign blame. He does not rush to conclusions. He allows meaning to reveal itself instead of forcing it. And in that patience, confusion weakens. Clarity also restores proportion. A confused mind magnifies problems. It turns small issues into existential threats. It escalates minor setbacks into personal failures. A clear mind sees scale. It knows what deserves energy and what does not. Many men exhaust themselves fighting battles that never needed to be fought. Confusion narrows vision. It creates tunnel thinking. Everything feels urgent, personal, and threatening. Clarity widens vision. It restores context. And context dissolves false urgency. A wise man does not ask, who is against me? He asks, what am I not seeing clearly? This question alone has saved countless men from unnecessary conflict. As clarity grows, the world becomes less hostile, not because people change, but because perception matures. Neutral events are no longer personalized. Differences are no longer demonized. Challenges are no longer exaggerated into threats. The man becomes calmer, not because life becomes gentle, but because his mind stops manufacturing danger. This does not make him passive. It makes him precise. When a real enemy appears, he recognizes it immediately, because his perception is not cluttered with illusions. His energy is not wasted on shadows. A confused D is always on edge. A clear mind is alert without being tense. And this is the quiet power of clarity. It reduces conflict by removing false targets. It restores peace by correcting perception. It returns energy by ending unnecessary wars. When a man no longer creates enemies where none exist, he finally has the strength to face the real challenges of life with calm and intelligence. Let me take you further now to the moment where something subtle but powerful begins to happen. When a man changes how he sees, the struggle inside him does not need to be fought anymore. It simply loosens its grip. Inner conflict survives only as long as perspective remains fixed. The moment perspective shifts, tension starts to dissolve. Most men believe conflict is created by opposing forces inside them, as if different parts are permanently at war. But conflict is not born from difference. It is born from misunderstanding. When the mind misinterprets its own signals, it turns them into opposition. When understanding enters, opposition fades. A man who sees his impulses as enemies will live in constant resistance. A man who sees them as messages will live in dialogue. The behavior may look similar from the outside, but the inner experience is entirely different. One is exhausting, the other is instructive. Perspective determines whether the mind becomes a battlefield or a classroom. When perspective changes, judgment softens. Instead of condemning himself for feeling a certain way, a wise man becomes curious. He asks what the feeling is pointing to. He listens instead of suppressing. And what is listened to no longer needs to shout. Inner conflict often comes from mislabeling emotions. Sadness is labeled as weakness. Fear is labeled as failure. Anger is labeled as danger. Once labeled, these emotions are rejected. Rejection creates tension. Tension creates conflict. A wise man corrects the labels. He sees sadness as information, fear as caution, anger as a boundary signal. The emotion does not disappear, but the fight with it does. And without the fight, the emotion completes its cycle naturally. This is how perspective transforms inner chaos into inner order. When a man changes how he interprets his thoughts, he stops arguing with them. He no longer tries to prove them wrong or force them away. He evaluates them. He asks whether they are helpful, accurate, and proportional. Many thoughts fail this test quietly, without resistance. Thoughts lose power when they are not believed blindly. Inner conflict also weakens when a man stops demanding certainty from himself. Many men are at war internally because they believe they must always know the right answer, the right path, the right move. When uncertainty appears, they panic, they criticize themselves, they rush. A wise man accepts that not knowing is part of being alive. He allows questions to exist without forcing premature answers. This permission reduces internal pressure, and pressure is what turns confusion into conflict. Perspective that allows uncertainty creates peace. As perspective matures, a man stops identifying with every inner experience. He understands that thoughts pass, emotions rise and fall, impulses come and go. None of these define him. This separation is not detachment, it is clarity. Clarity creates space, and space dissolves conflict. A man who identifies with every thought feels attacked by his own mind. A man who observes thoughts understands that they are events, not commands. This understanding transforms the inner landscape from hostile to manageable. Perspective also changes how a man relates to mistakes. Instead of seeing them as evidence of inadequacy, he sees them as feedback. Feedback invites learning. Judgment invites shame. And shame fuels inner conflict more than any external challenge ever could. A wise man learns from himself without humiliating himself. When perspective shifts, self-compassion becomes possible. Not indulgence, but fairness. The mind becomes a place of guidance instead of punishment. And when punishment ends, rebellion disappears. This is why inner conflict often decreases as wisdom increases. Not because the man becomes perfect, but because he becomes accurate. Accuracy dissolves unnecessary struggle. A changed perspective also improves relationships. When a man no longer fights himself, he stops projecting conflict onto others. He listens more clearly. He reacts less defensively. He allows disagreement without interpreting it as threat. Inner peace creates outer stability. As perspective continues to refine, the mind grows quieter. Not empty, but ordered. Thoughts line up instead of colliding. Emotions flow instead of clashing. Decisions feel simpler because fewer internal voices are screaming at once. This quiet is not forced. It emerges naturally when misunderstanding is replaced by insight. A wise man knows that peace is not achieved by silencing parts of himself, but by understanding them. He becomes a mediator within his own mind, not a tyrant. And when perspective fully shifts, inner conflict loses its reason to exist. There is nothing left to fight because everything has been seen clearly. When understanding replaces misinterpretation, the war ends without a single blow being struck. Let me guide you now to a place where wisdom truly begins, because many men spend their entire lives looking in the wrong direction. They examine the world endlessly, trying to control it, predict it, or defend themselves from it. They ask why people behave the way they do, why life is unfair, why obstacles appear at the worst moments. But wisdom does not begin by interrogating the world. It begins by questioning the lens through which the world is seen. A man can look at the same reality for years and never understand it, not because reality is hiding, but because his perspective has never been examined. Most suffering is not caused by what happens, but by the meaning assigned to what happens. And meaning is never neutral. It is shaped by beliefs, experiences, fears, and expectations. When a man mistakes his interpretation for absolute truth, he stops learning. He becomes rigid, and rigidity is the opposite of wisdom. A wise man is not the one with the strongest opinions. He is the one who knows his opinions come from somewhere. When something disturbs you deeply, wisdom does not ask, "Why is this happening to me?" It asks, "What belief inside me is being challenged right now?" That question turns discomfort into insight. It shifts attention from blame to understanding. The world does not need to change for a man to suffer less. His lens does. Many men believe they are seeing clearly simply because their view feels familiar. Familiarity is comforting, but it is not proof of accuracy. A belief held for years can still be wrong. A perspective reinforced by repetition can still be distorted. Wisdom requires the courage to doubt what feels obvious. This doubt is not weakness. It is intelligence applied inward. A man who never questions his lens becomes predictable. He reacts the same way, makes the same mistakes, feels the same frustrations. Life feels repetitive because his perception is repetitive. When the lens changes, life feels new without anything external changing. Wisdom grows when a man notices patterns in how he interprets events. He sees how often he assumes intent, how quickly he personalizes outcomes, how frequently he expects disappointment. These patterns reveal the lens, not the world. And once the lens is visible, it can be refined. A wise man does not ask whether his thoughts are comforting. He asks whether they are accurate. He understands that truth is sometimes uncomfortable, but clarity always reduces suffering in the long run. Comfort without clarity creates illusion. Clarity without comfort creates growth. This is why wisdom often feels unsettling at first. It removes familiar explanations. It dissolves old narratives. It challenges the stories a man has told himself about who he is and how life works. But in doing so, it frees him. Questioning the lens also restores humility. A man realizes that his view is one among many, not the final verdict on reality. This humility opens the door to learning. He listens more. He reacts less. He observes before concluding. A rigid lens demands certainty. A wise lens allows revision. This flexibility does not make a man weak. It makes him resilient. A flexible perspective adapts when circumstances change. A rigid one breaks. Wisdom also reveals how much inner suffering comes from expectations that were never examined. Expectations about how people should behave, how quickly success should arrive, how life should unfold. When reality violates these expectations, frustration appears. But the frustration is not caused by reality, it is caused by the expectation. A wise man reviews his expectations instead of resenting the world for not meeting them. This does not make him passive. It makes him strategic. He adjusts his approach instead of exhausting himself with resistance. He learns where to accept and where to act, and that discernment is wisdom in action. Questioning the lens also dissolves the illusion of personal attack. Many men suffer because they interpret neutral events as judgments against them. A missed opportunity becomes proof of inadequacy. A disagreement becomes disrespect. A delay becomes rejection. When the lens is questioned, these interpretations lose certainty. Not everything is about you, and realizing that is a relief. A wise man learns to separate self-worth from outcomes. He sees outcomes as information, not verdicts. This perspective stabilizes him. He can fail without collapsing, succeed without arrogance, and navigate uncertainty without panic. Wisdom also deepens compassion. When a man understands how perspective shapes behavior, he judges others less harshly. He sees that many actions come from confusion, fear, or unexamined beliefs. This does not excuse harm, but it reduces unnecessary hatred. Clarity softens the heart without weakening the spine. As the lens becomes clearer, life becomes simpler. Decisions feel less dramatic. Problems feel more manageable. The constant inner commentary quiets down, not because the man knows everything, but because he understands how to see. And this is the quiet gift of wisdom. It does not promise control over life, but it offers clarity within life. It teaches a man where his power truly lies, not in forcing outcomes, but in refining perception. When a man finally learns to question the lens instead of fighting the world, he stops wasting energy on illusions and begins responding to reality as it truly is. Let me bring this to its natural completion by sharing the final understanding that ties everything together. When clarity is complete, the idea of an inner enemy disappears entirely. What once felt like something dark, opposing, or controlling is revealed as misunderstanding that has finally been resolved. Nothing was defeated. Nothing was destroyed. It was simply understood. A man only fights himself when he does not understand himself. Inner enemies are born when parts of the mind are misinterpreted. A thought appears and is judged as dangerous. An emotion arises and is labeled as weakness. An impulse surfaces and is treated as corruption. These judgments fracture the inner world. The mind splits into sides and conflict begins. But clarity reunites what misunderstanding divided. Understanding transforms opposition into insight. When a man sees clearly, he no longer needs to label parts of himself as good or bad. He sees function instead of threat. He sees messages instead of attacks. And when everything inside him has a place and a purpose, nothing needs to take control through force. Control only appears when understanding is absent. A clear mind recognizes that thoughts are not commands. Emotions are not verdicts. Urges are not identities. They are experiences passing through awareness. And awareness, when steady, does not need to fight what passes through it. This realization removes fear at its root. Not fear of the world, but fear of the self. Many men live in quiet anxiety not because life is dangerous, but because they do not trust their own inner landscape. They fear their thoughts, their impulses, their reactions. Clarity restores trust. Trust dissolves the need for internal control. A wise man knows that nothing inside him needs to be eliminated. Everything needs to be understood. Even the most uncomfortable thoughts lose their power when they are seen clearly. They cannot dominate what is fully conscious. This is why clarity is liberation. It ends the illusion of inner captivity. When clarity is present, the mind becomes integrated. Different parts communicate instead of compete. Reason listens to emotion. Emotion informs reason. Instinct signals. Awareness decides. This cooperation creates stability that no amount of force ever could. Force divides. Clarity unifies. A unified mind is calm, not because it lacks intensity, but because it lacks contradiction. Energy flows in one direction instead of being wasted in internal struggle. The man feels whole. Wholeness leaves no room for inner enemies. Clarity also brings responsibility, but not the heavy kind. It brings ownership without blame. A man no longer says, "Something inside me made me do this." He says, "I see what led me here." That understanding empowers change without shame. Shame thrives in confusion. Growth thrives in clarity. As clarity deepens, the man stops dramatizing his inner experiences. Thoughts are no longer interpreted as signs of doom. Emotions are no longer treated as emergencies. The nervous system calms because it is no longer receiving false alarms. The mind becomes a place of guidance instead of threat. This does not mean life becomes effortless. It means effort becomes focused. Challenges are met directly instead of being magnified internally. The man engages reality instead of battling his interpretations of it. Clarity brings presence, and presence ends inner tyranny. A present man cannot be controlled by imagined futures or replayed pasts. He responds to what is real now, and what is real now is almost always manageable. This is the final maturity of wisdom, not the absence of struggle, but the absence of unnecessary struggle. When clarity is complete, the story of an inner enemy collapses. It is seen for what it always was, a misunderstanding that felt real only because it was never questioned. The man does not feel victorious. He feels relieved. Relief is the quiet proof of truth. And from this place, he moves through life with steadiness. Not because he is perfect, but because he is clear. Not because nothing affects him, but because nothing controls him from the shadows. In clarity, the mind stops fighting itself, and the man finally stands undivided.